think we can slowly start, and if people join late, I will just admit them to the call as well. So first of all, I want to welcome everyone to our very first inaugural lecture of the ISHA Talks, which is a new type of series we're hosting with the PhD and training committee. And we're kind of aiming to make this like an online space for young scholars, early career researchers, and historians to share their research results, a recent publication, or to get feedback on their ongoing PhD research, or just to share what they're working on in their internships or in their jobs related to history. We're very happy to have Klára Řiháková here as our very first speaker, because we think that the topic just fits so well for ISHA. So Klára Řiháková is a second-year part-time master student at the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, and she has obtained her BA degree in English Literature and History at Northumbria University in Newcastle upon Tyne in 2022, if I'm correct, for which she wrote a BA dissertation highlighting the intertwined nature of student activism, political developments, mobility scholarship schemes, and activists. And she continued this line of research as her main interests lie in the transnational approach to the history of activism and social movements transgressing the Cold War boundaries. And last year, she published her research in Carnival on student exchanges between Czechoslovakia and the UK. And then today she will be our honored speaker presenting that research paper, which she transformed to a 30-minute lecture for our ISHA community. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Klára. I think we will turn off our cameras just to make sure that the connection goes well. We are recording the ISHA talk. More info on that later, because we're working on a new website page as well for the ISHA talks. And afterwards, we will have 30 minutes for discussion and questions. So voilà, enjoy everyone. And Klára, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and hello everyone. Yeah, so as was said, I will turn off my camera as well because of my Wi-Fi. But if you wouldn't hear me or anything, just please put a message into the chat or something, and yeah, I will try to resolve that. So as was already said in this talk, I will walk you through my article published in the association's journal Carnival. And my article examined transnational elements of university student exchanges across the Iron Curtain, more precisely between the UK and Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. The article analysed the interaction opportunities between Czechoslovak and British students that were enabled through the British-Czechoslovak Cultural Exchange between 1948 and 1970. In the talk, I will highlight my research outcomes, such as that student networks did not appear unexpectedly in the 1960s. I will also aim to convey the message that Czechoslovak students were part of a wider transnationally dynamic student network before 1968, and thus challenge the notion of the impenetrable Iron Curtain. Lastly, my article dealt with not only the political events of the Prague Spring, but also drew attention to students who studied or found exile in Britain. And my presentation will emphasize the response of the British student body to the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 1968, which resulted in the launch of the Czechoslovak Students Scholarship Fund. So first, I will try to introduce you to my research aims at the beginning of my research. And then I will highlight some primary and secondary sources that I was drawing on in my article. And eventually, I will focus on the research and text itself. So the basic question that I asked at the beginning of my research was how did the Cold War climate affect Czechoslovak students? When I answered this with the key dates that are, I guess, familiar to you, precisely the 1948 communist takeover and 1968 Prague Spring and Warsaw Pact invasion, The research time frame was kind of clear. And from this time frame, other research questions slowly unfolded. As someone who comes from a mixed Czech and Slovak family, and having studied in the UK using transnational and international structures to do so, I was curious if there was a connection between the British and Czechoslovak students before and during the 1960s. And if so, how did these contacts influence the student experience? By asking these questions, I aimed to contribute to the field of transnational history and position the history of the Czechoslovak student movement onto the transnational scene. As you have already probably noticed, I'm going to use the term transnational a lot, so I think a brief explanation is in order. In my research, I'm following the definition of Daniel Lacroix, who understands international in terms of scale, such as people coming together from several different nations, whereas the term transnational, according to him, refers to specific characteristics, such as activists cooperating with each other beyond national borders, borrowing ideas from abroad, or traveling to meetings with activists. Additionally, for Lacroix, transnational also often highlights the role of non-state actors, as will be the case of Czechoslovak students as well. So in my research, I was drawing on, for example, the Foreign Office documents from the National Archives in Kew in London, and then also the National Union of Students materials from the Modern Records Center at Warwick University, and Czechoslovak governmental documents from the Security Forces Archive in Brno, Czech Republic. But crucial for my research were also newspapers like The Guardian and The Times, or student journals from Czechoslovakia. On this slide, you can see just a brief mention of some secondary literature that was important in my research, coming from authors such as Richard Ivan Jobs, Joel Kotek from the Czech, also Milan Otáhal. And if you would like a full bibliography, I can also, of course, share it after the event. Before diving into the international and transnational connections of Czechoslovak students, I think also Czechoslovak historical context is quite necessary at this point. As I mentioned before, since 1948, Czechoslovakia was under communist rule. In the second half of the 1950s, Joseph Stalin died, and also in the same year as Joseph Stalin, Czechoslovak communist leader Klement Gottwald died too. This led to a brief political relaxation in Czechoslovakia. So, as probably all of you know, the term Prague Spring describes a period of unprecedented political, cultural, and economic liberalization in Czechoslovakia. Although next spring, the process of change can be most radically observed since January 1968, when Alexander Dubček replaced Antonín Novotný as General Secretary of the Czechoslovak Communist Party, and then also Ludvík Svoboda, who you can see on the left on this picture, succeeded Novotný as Czechoslovak President on 30th March 1968. These changes on the highest political level marked the beginning of the subsequent liberalization in the form of reforms articulated in the so-called Action Program. Before I move to the student experience of 1968, I should explain also some specifics of the 60s student generation. So for the group of people aged around 20 years old, during the Prague Spring, the liberalization meant the first encounter with some degree of pluralism and political freedom, since they likely spent their childhood during the initial years after the communist takeover. It is also important to note that students who expressed their activism in the second half of the 1960s were the first contemporary generation who did not experience the Second World War. And more importantly, a critique of the whole Stalinist system marked their adolescence, as a 1965 state report noted. At this point, I should also introduce you to the international student organizations that affected connections of international students, including the ones from Czechoslovakia and Britain. So the Cold War period witnessed a rapid increase in international student organizations. First, there was the World Federation of Democratic Youth, which was set up in London in 1945. Then there was the International Union of Students, of which Czechoslovak student unions were part. And this was founded in Prague in 1946, and it lasted until the 1990s. And finally, there was the International Student Conference, for which I unfortunately haven't found a suitable and available picture. And the International Student Conference was a rival organization of the International Union of Students. It was founded in 1950 in Stockholm by 21 national unions that broke away from the IUS. It is, I think, also important to note that both the Federation of Democratic Youth and the IUS were controlled by the Soviet Union, whereas the International Student Conference was sponsored by the CIA, as Joel Kotek described in his book. As I said, all of these organizations influenced the transnational connections of students, for instance, through the first World Festival of Youth and Students in 1947, or conferences where students debated about politics and discussed their universal experiences. And therefore, finally, we get to the actual interactions between Czechoslovak and British students. Already between 1936 and 1935 and 36, sorry, there was a scheme between by the British Council for Student Exchanges. So there was probably a tradition to follow after the end of the Second World War. The student exchange trend was a renewed practice from 1945 to 1946, as the British Council assigned 9 scholarships out of 100 to Czechoslovakia, and especially to students who wished to learn English and subsequently teach it as well. Additionally, students also had opportunities to meet their peers at the already mentioned First World Festival of Youth and Students, which was organized by the World Federation of Democratic Youth and the International Union of Students in Prague, just a year before the communist coup in 1947. The seeming unity of the international youth apparent from the festival, however, did not have a long duration and was put under pressure when the Czechoslovak state police attacked Czechoslovak students during their protests in February 1948. This event also influenced the British National Union of Students of England, Scotland, and Wales. I will use the abbreviation NUS for it. Because the NUS discussed its possible withdrawal from the IUS at a council meeting in Oxford in July 1948, which was also attended by Czechoslovak students to testify about the situation in their home country. Naturally, after the communist coup, the new state government aimed to restrain the movement of citizens to foreign countries. So it produced a new set of policies dealing with trips abroad, visa insurance, and the arrival of foreigners in 1949. The Communist Party aimed to minimize travel in both directions to the smallest possible measure, as the quote states. Consequently, because of this, some international structures were disrupted as the state began to decide who would be let to travel abroad. This was also the case of the British Council scholarships issued for Czechoslovaks, as suspicions regarding the scholarships arose on both sides. Therefore, since 1st May 1950, the cultural relationships under which the scholarships were issued between the UK and Czechoslovakia were treated, quote, as a debt for the time being. Therefore, what is clear from this slide is that student and academic exchanges were at the center of a dispute between the two countries after the February coup. Furthermore, the cultural climate clearly influenced the lives of students, since they also suffered the consequences of cooling political relations. So, as I already mentioned, in the second half of the 1950s, there was a slight relaxation, political relaxation, after the death of the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Joseph Stalin, and also the Czechoslovak president Gottwald died in the same year in 1953. And there was also the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in 1956, which further affected the situation in the Soviet bloc. Despite a succession of anti-reform presidents in Czechoslovakia, Antonín Zápotocký in 1953 and Antonín Novotný in 1957, Czechoslovak students became active in production of so-called resolutions in the spring of 1956. Students of Charles University in Prague were among the first to produce such resolutions. And from one of such resolutions, it is apparent that students were well aware of difficulties relating to studying abroad and wanted to gain new experience and establish new connections in foreign countries. Due to a new political situation, we can also see a slight relaxation of travel policy in the 1950s, in the late 1950s. Therefore, for example, representatives of Czechoslovakia attended the 10th International Student Travel Conference in Edinburgh, held in 1959. Moreover, the exchange program that I mentioned before for university students, which was part of the cultural agreement between UK and Czechoslovakia, was renewed since the early 1960s, as the British Committee for the University Exchange saw such interaction as beneficial for establishing contacts between universities and the countries. Therefore, it is evident that once more the Cold War climate affected both sides and of the Iron Curtain, and the developing political situation in Czechoslovakia affected the change of travel policy, which in turn had an impact on opportunities for international student travel and consequently student interaction. More importantly, however, there is evidence of youth mobility from before 1968. And although, of course, youth mobility is a distinct feature of 1968, it should not be only seen as an aspect of one single year. So from the records that I visited, it is clear that from 1963 to 1964, the student exchange program operated on an annual basis, and each year talks between representatives of Czechoslovakia and the UK were held. As you can see from the slide, further exchanges included, for example, summer camps. So, for example, between 1966 and 68, 9 places for students from Czechoslovakia were allocated at such camps. One example for all is, for example, the National Union of Students Summer School at Loughborough, where 10 Czechoslovak students were received in August 1966. The university exchange programs were also promoted in Czechoslovak student journals. And some of the British institutions included in the program at the time were the University of Leeds, the University of Strathclyde, Glasgow Veterinary College, Reading University, and Birmingham University. And finally, from the records, it is apparent that between 1966 and 67, 80 young people from both countries participated in the student and youth exchange between Czechoslovakia and United Kingdom, with the level of exchanges slightly increased in comparison with the last year, as the records state. So hopefully some conclusions emerge from this part. The section from the agreement of the student exchanges, which you can see in the second paragraph here, demonstrates that although the suspicion resulting from the Cold War climate might have persisted, they no longer influence the young people and students' lives. And it is also apparent that the governments of both countries consciously intended for students to interact, since they must have known that this would lead to an exchange of ideas, such as that about political development between the young people. Overall, it is apparent that the British side intended for student interactions in hopes of influencing them. And student exchanges also suggest that the Iron Curtain was more prone to perforation than it might seem from historiography. And finally, it was on these occasions that the Czechoslovak and British students had opportunities to establish structures which might become valuable after the August crisis in 1968, as I will discuss in the following part. So the student experience of the Prague Spring had also its transnational dimension. Czechoslovaks were experiencing not only unprecedented freedom of speech, but also freedom of travel in 1968. For instance, the estimates state that over 690,000 citizens traveled to the West between 1968 and spring 1969. However, the travel stream went also the other way around, as Paul Hoffman, a journalist, noted in a 1968 article from the New York Times. I will read just a short quotation from it. Young Czechoslovaks and young foreigners drink beer together in taverns, they go together to the movies and discuss them afterwards. They hold joint dances and folk song sessions. End of quote. Nevertheless, not all the youth shared the same opinions. For example, according to a British visitor, Nick Wright, Czechoslovak youth appeared to be idealizing the West, and when he returned from his travels, he was, quote, firmly of the view that the Red Army needed to intervene. On the other side of the spectrum, Czechoslovak students often disagreed with their Western peers over the question of socialism, which many young activists in the 1960s in the West idealized. Richard Ivan Jobs, a historian, reports the hopes of one activist who, quote, expected Prague youth through travel to gain experience, to develop ideas, interact with broader Western youth culture, and become part of it and its transnational moment for social change. Furthermore, the transnational interactions can also be demonstrated through the BBC debate panel called Students in Revolt, which saw students from Belgium, Britain, Czechoslovakia, Italy, Japan, Spain, the United States, and Yugoslavia participating in a discussion about student movement. For the British side, the student leader who took part was Tariq Ali. He's the one in the middle with the mustache, and I will talk about him in a moment again. And who I'm going to mention again in a moment is also Jan Kavan, Czechoslovak student activist who took part in the debate for Czechoslovakia. So it is apparent that the Prague Spring and the political reforms facilitated the increase in the development of social contacts between students of different nationalities with different diverse opinions on political situation. So although the reforms put in place during the Prague Spring were promising for many Czechoslovaks, the atmosphere of change did not last for long. The reform process in Czechoslovakia was marked as an internal counter-revolution by the Soviet Union and used as an excuse for an invasion by armies of the Warsaw Pact, including the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, East Germany, Poland, and Hungary, on the night of 20 to 21st August 1968. This event affected the lives of all Czechoslovaks, including students, of course. However, some students were located outside of Czechoslovakia at the time of the invasion. Due to the unprecedented travel increase, which I described before, many students found themselves in the situation of emigrating or even being stranded in foreign countries, such as the UK. It is estimated that around 2,600 Czechoslovak students were in Britain in August 1968. And the response of the British student body to this event was full of solidarity, one might say. For example, there was a demonstration in support of Czechoslovakia, which erupted in front of the Soviet embassy in London on 21st August, and which also included Tariq Ali, who I mentioned before, a significant figure in the British student movement at the time, who took the part in the BBC debate Students in Revolt. Just 2 days after the invasion, the National Union of Students set up a help desk in London for Czechoslovak students. Furthermore, the NUS played also a crucial role in informing British authorities about students who wished to remain in the UK. Additionally, the NUS, alongside the Scottish Union of Students, Welsh Union of Students, the British Youth Council, and the United Nations Student Association, were at the birth of the Czechoslovak Students Scholarship Fund, which helped stranded students to complete their studies in the UK. The fund was launched by Lord Murray of New Haven. It was chaired by Christopher Seton Watson, and during the three academic years between 1968 and 1970, it distributed over 143,000 pounds to Czechoslovak students in need. From the extract, which you can see on this slide, it is apparent that NUS became involved in helping Czechoslovak students because of their involvement in the Prague Spring. And also one of the beneficiaries of the fund was the already mentioned student activist Jan Kavan, who took part in the BBC debate panel alongside Tariq Ali. Works. So in a nutshell, hopefully some conclusions can be drawn from the previous slides. Transnational ties between Czechoslovak and British student bodies had gained momentum before 1968, but in 1968 they achieved their height. It is also clear that the rise in foreign travel across the Iron Curtain caused an increase in student meetings, sometimes revealing different political views. Activism enabled students in both countries to make transnational structures and interactions, and these ties we can see the parallels with them with the significant solidarity from the British students to their Czechoslovak peers who emigrated or were stranded there due to the occupation, as the Czechoslovak Students Scholarship Fund helped numerous students to study and consequently build a life in the UK. Additionally, the study of transnational student movements, such as that from Czechoslovakia, can greatly contribute, I think, to the historical debate. For instance, the impenetrability of the Iron Curtain can be questioned, and also it adds another nuance to the Cold War narrative. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, ISHA, for giving me this floor to present my research, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Klára. Let's give her a digital applause quickly. Okay, so let's open the floor for questions. Is there someone who wants to kick off the questions and discussions? Barbara just says that she's back and she has a question, I think. So Barbara, feel free to open your microphone. Oh, she's still on the train. Okay, well then maybe I'll just quickly read it out loud, or if someone wants to repeat Barbara's question. Okay, so Barbara says, interesting work, especially how you underlined the permeability of the Iron Curtain. We tend to think of a total separation between the two worlds, but in reality, such a vision wasn't so much interiorized by the general population, even though, of course, the Cold War hindered the mobility of people, especially in certain areas. So her question is, do you think, or do you have evidence of the building of the Berlin Wall to be an indirect cause for the students' need for re-establishing inter- and transnational connections? And she's thinking about a reaction that hindered mobility of some part of Europe. Some initial thoughts on that question.
Thank you, first of all, for the question, and I think it is a really good question, and I haven't thought about looking for this direction in records. So, no, unfortunately, I don't have any evidence of this Berlin Wall building of the Berlin Wall causing or being influential in the Czechoslovak student mobility, but I haven't looked for it, so that doesn't mean it's not there.
Thank you. Someone else with a question? Piotr, yeah, go ahead. Piotr, you must be very interested because you're also working on student organizations and exchanges, right?
Yes, exactly. And this is also my period, so I'm really glad to meet another person who is dealing with this topic. And I have many questions, but I would like to ask one of them because you presented like this exchange between two countries. So I would like to ask you about broader context, because this is Cold War is not only time of like confrontation between two blocs, but is also time of cultural confrontation, and both Western countries, mainly United States and Soviet Union, tend to use their, let's say, soft power for making cultural influence in the opposite side of the Iron Curtain. So I would like to ask you about using these Czechoslovak students and their stay in the West as a part of this process of influencing Western countries and promoting socialism abroad.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. The student exchanges and the cultural agreement between the two countries, I think, can be definitely seen from the viewpoint of cultural diplomacy of the both countries, not only Czechoslovakia, but also that of the UK. I'm currently researching the late 1980s and the cultural diplomacy in that time. And I think in the 1960s, it was similar in many regards, that the like both sides of the agreement between Czechoslovakia and United Kingdom consciously intended for students to interact. So I think to believe that this led to like, how would I say that? Influencing the students on both sides, the Czechoslovaks visiting UK, but also the British ones visiting Czechoslovak is the correct assumption. And also the program was temporarily terminated between the 1950s and 1960s. And from the records, it was clear that this was because of the suspicions. For example, the British side was very suspicious about the people who Czechoslovaks were sending to UK, and thought that it was very dangerous to send the British students to Czechoslovakia because of the indoctrination. So yeah, I hope I answered the question.
Oh yes, thank you. And maybe like one more question, if I can ask now about sources, because do you use sources of state secret police of Czechoslovakia? Because what I know from Poland, there are plenty of information from these archives, because they are public now, and so you can easily use them in your investigation. And foreign students, it was what was really interesting for the secret state police, and they paid a lot of attention to everything they did, and especially for their political behaviors, their political orientation. So yeah, this is what I can suggest for you.
Yeah, I was, I think, trying to, when I was researching for my bachelor thesis, and then researching for the article to get to some records from the state police regarding this, but I haven't get hold of any. But I will definitely try to pursue this more in future.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe have a follow-up question on sources as well. Because you deal a lot with institutional and policy documents, and then you also have the voice of the student, which I can assume was much harder to grasp and to get hold of. You talk about these student journals, so maybe you can expand a bit on the ISHA documents that you encountered and in which ways students write and communicate about their experiences.
So in the 1960s, as I said, and especially in 1968, there were many new student journals, especially from Prague universities. And these are now thankfully digitized and online, so I was able to access them from the UK. And in these journals, I found various like advertisements for the student exchange programs. So this was one source, and also the student experience can be found in the resolutions, which I mentioned, and which were translated by British academics for British research as well. And in these resolutions, the students were kind of critical of the regime's, how would I put it, of the regime's way of influencing the student experience. They were, they didn't like that the only thing that they could look up to was the Soviet model. So yeah, I hope that answers it.
Yeah, and I'm interested, do they mostly talk about big political and ideological ideas and differences, or do they also talk about the more mundane things like the food, accommodation, transport, the weather, I don't know, the more day-to-day things of their exchange?
Definitely, they talk about more day-to-day things than about the political side, especially in the journals, because although there wasn't like too much they weren't that overseen in the 1968. It was still kind of, they had to go through this whole process of publishing it through the official channels. So yeah, they talked about how you will get there, who will pay for it, and so.
Thank you. Is there someone else with a question of our online audience? Michailo, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. So I need to say that I really enjoyed in your presentation, and I'm really happy because I had the opportunity to attend the lecture. But for my current research, I have two questions, if you don't mind, about specific periods. How many connections were between Czechoslovakia and Western Europe during two periods, between 1953, after the protest and revolution in Plzeň, and 1957, so after Hungarian Revolution. Is there any connection between Western and Eastern students, between state exchange, however, and between 1966 to 1968, when students lead the protest against Novotny, again, sport reforms and so on. So were they had any connections between countries, especially in student terms?
Thank you for the feedback and also for the questions. Well, between 1953 and 1957, from what I can draw from between the Czechoslovak and UK, there wasn't any institutionalized student exchange because the culture agreement was terminated, and yeah, they didn't basically talk to each other. In this case, I have not researched any transnational interactions in this period. Especially, I also haven't looked at the interactions with the Eastern Bloc as well. Yeah, so I won't be probably able to answer to that. And the second period was 1967.
From 1966 to 1968, during the protest against Novotny.
Yeah. Well, I haven't again found much from the British students during this period up until the Prague Spring. There was something in the British newspapers about the protests against Novotny, but that wasn't from the British students' perspective. It was just a British journalism thing. But based on this, I believe that the notion of Czechoslovak students protesting their system was quite widespread in the UK.
Thank you. And we have like a bit over 10 minutes more for questions. Someone else who... Julia, please go ahead.
Hi, I hope you guys can hear me despite of the lawnmower nearby. But I just wanted to ask a very practical question, because we always get students who are starting to deal with archival research or starting to think of primary sources. And I think it's really impressive that you managed to go to so many archives and get very different primary sources on your BA thesis. So I thought that maybe you could tell us a little bit about the process, how you found them, how you communicated with the archives at first, and if you have any ideas, advice for BA students who are trying to come up with their archives, and that would be lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I had it kind of easier because I was traveling between the UK and Czech Republic for like Christmas vacation and so on. So I mainly tried to communicate with the Czech archives regarding their visitor hours during Christmas, and So in this way, it was like easier for me to do so. But there were during it was in 2022, so there were some COVID restrictions at the time, and because of this, I also spent more time in Czech Republic than I expected. So yeah, this was quite a useful side to the pandemic for me. But regarding the British archives, I think it's great how the British archives have it like all kind of centralized. That although if they don't have the specific document that you are looking for in the archives in London, they have it in their database and they can direct you to the specific archive, which was the case of the Modern Records Center at Warwick University, for which I also got tip from my supervisor. So yeah, communicating with the supervisor, then also trying to make use of all the time the country that you're visiting would be my top advices, I guess.
And did you notice some big difference in the type of documents stored in both national contexts? Because I can assume we're dealing with two like different influence sphere. Did you find big differences in style, language, bureaucracy, if you had to compare them very quickly?
Well, I haven't visited the National Archive of the Czech Republic, so I can't say much to that. But regarding the language, I think the language in the Security Forces Archive of the Czech Republic was very, how would I say that? Like, I had to a little bit read into the lines, much more than I had to in the British Archive, I would say.
Someone else wants to jump in with a question? Otherwise, I still have some questions on my paper here. So I think David is writing a question at the moment, but maybe about your research process and about the whole framing of your research topic. So I myself deal with diplomacy, which is always a very bilateral context from one country to the other country. And in your case, it might seem simple in the first place as well. It's from country A to B and from country B back to A. But you frame it in a transnational context. And was there some kind of event or a source or a quote that triggered your thinking about putting these exchanges in a transnational context? Or how did you find your way to this like theoretical framework of transnationalism?
Well, in my final year of my bachelor, I took a course on student activism, and one of the frameworks that we discussed student activism in was the transnational history. So I arrived to this framework through the university, but it's true that when I was reading initially in like September of my final year, some newspapers and the articles, it kind of started to, how would I say that, emerge from the text, like the Czechoslovak Students Scholarship Fund was something which was an initiative of student organizations. And although it was chaired by many like important institutionalized people, it was something which was a student initiative as well. And so when I was thinking about my module for the student activism, I started to think in these lines also when I was reading the articles. So yeah, that was it for me.
Thank you. Julia has to go. David, if you want, you can also just open your mic to ask your question. We can't hear you, David, or at least I can't. I see that your mic is open, but about David and maybe in the end types his question. I have another question about the sources, because you then often have sources talking about students and how the students were supposed to, or how they imagine that the students taught. How did you deal with these type of sources and like the critical reflection against people talking about the students that you are studying?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Could you repeat it once?
Yeah, so you often probably have policymakers or politicians talking about students and how students think, or like kind of guessing how students will react to the exchange because they were afraid that they would be indoctrinated, for example. Like, in your opinion, were they correct, or were they too pessimistic thinking about the students? Or how do you feel that tension between the idea of the student and the actual student in this time?
Well, I think in some aspects they were definitely like correct, especially in the 1950s when many, like, I'm not saying that all of the Czechoslovak student movement, because there were protests against the communist coup, but some of the students were definitely like proactive and in the communist like regime, and they haven't viewed it as problematic as we might today. So I think it's important to be aware of these differences within the student movement, and to be like open to all kinds of opinions that at the time people like politicians and diplomats might have had about the student movement. So this is my answer, hopefully.
Thank you. And maybe do you have evidence of these students that went on the exchange or that stayed in the country after they couldn't travel back? Did they continue like their activist activities, or did they go into politics themselves or into education?
Yeah, definitely. For example, Jan Kavan, the student leader who took part in the BBC debate, then he also benefited from the fund. He then continued to be very active during the 1970s and 80s regarding the Czechoslovak dissent. He was copyphoting the material from Czechoslovak dissidents. He established like a journal where he published some of the opinion statements from Czechoslovakia, like from Charter 77. And after the revolution, he went to the politics and he became, I'm not sure right now, actually, he became a minister in one of the governments, but I'm not sure what minister, what he was.
That definitely testifies to the importance of these student exchanges, I think. We still have time for one or two quick questions. Someone who wants to maybe ask the final question. If not, maybe Klára, what will your future research be about? Are you expanding on the topic, maybe looking at a different country with a student exchange, or what will we expect from you for the next ISHA talk, maybe?
Well, actually, currently I'm researching transnational dimension of 1989 and the Velvet Revolution and the students' role again in it. And yeah, it was brought up to me by my supervisor from UK. So I can't say how much the international and transnational structures influenced me in my studies, and how much they probably influenced the students in the past. So I'm excited about the research of 1989 in transnational dimension. And yeah, I'm just trying to finish my master's degree, and then we'll see.
Cool, thank you. And with arriving in 1989, we start where ISHA started in 1989. So it's, I think, a very nice end of today's ISHA talk. So I want to thank everyone for attending today's talk. Many thanks to you, Klára, for sharing your fascinating research with us. I said the website is under construction, so soon we will announce the next speakers. If you're interested in giving a talk yourself, you can reach out to us to training@isha.international or to info@isha.international. And we hope to see you on the next edition, and we wish you a lot of good luck in your future research, Klára. Thank you again,
Thank you very
and
much.
good night, everyone.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, it was our pleasure. Bye, everyone. Ciao.